In the first video, we looked at the problem of intentionality and how it may present a serious challenge to materialistic and naturalistic theories of mind. There hasn't been a successful explanation of intentionality in physical terms thus far, but there are several attempts. This video will look at a few of these. To refresh, intentionality is when something is a representation or pointer to some specific target or referent. The first video showed how computers are not good counterexamples of materialistic examples of intentionality, as we humans are the ones applying meaning to the operations of computers. In this video, we'll go through some of the attempts at materialistic explanations. Let's consider the possibility that something represents something else in virtue of the fact that it relates to other representations. So, for example, your thought about Mount Everest refers to Mount Everest because of its relationship to other neighboring thoughts, such as mountains are large landforms, the Himalayas are a mountain range in China and Nepal, and so forth. So a thought represents something by being in context with other thoughts that also represent things. The obvious question is that, while this nicely explains how a thought has a specific meaning, it doesn't explain how anything has any meaning at all. All these other thoughts also have meaning, and if they get their meaning from the context of other thoughts, then you go to infinity and never end up explaining how any thought has meaning at all in the first place. The answer is that these thoughts rest on a background of non-intentional capacities for acting with the world. At the foundational level, there is, for example, the behavioral capacity for climbing a mountain, and this forms the foundation of the thoughts and beliefs having the meaning that they do. The problem with this is that there's a fundamental difference between motion and intentional acting. A river flowing down a hill is not intentional action, it's just matter in motion. An unconscious behavior, such as fleeing from a predator or whatever, is an intentional action since it is directed towards a specific target. So the behavior at the bottom level would still have to be intentional if it is to explain anything, and so it leaves intentionality still unreduced. An improvement of this theory is to recognize that for a thought to represent something else, it must connect somehow with the external world. So if there's a constant conjunction between an external stimulus, such as the vision of Mount Everest, along with the internal brain event that processes it, then eventually the thought or brain event will come to represent its referent. The external stimulus is causing the thought to point to something. This theory is appealing but has several problems. The first problem is that it can't account for misrepresentation. You might have a thought about Mount Everest, but in fact be mistaken, and your thought is really about the neighboring mountain Lhotse, because it is at night and conditions are bad and you are mistaken. So in this case, your thought about Mount Everest is caused not by Everest, but by Lhotse at night, or Lhotse in bad conditions. This further raises yet another problem. If Mount Everest or Lhotse at night can cause your thought about Mount Everest, then why should the thought be considered a thought about Mount Everest rather than a thought about Mount Everest or Lhotse in bad conditions? Why does Everest get to win and be what the thought is about? A possible response to this is to say that the stimulus, Mount Everest, normally causes a thought, but other stimuli are parasitic on it, like Lhotse in bad conditions. The second thought would not exist without the parent thought, which is caused by Mount Everest. But there are other problems. Your thought about Mount Everest might be caused not by Mount Everest, but by hallucinogenic drugs, or by the Matrix. Perhaps we live in the Matrix and there is no actual Mount Everest, in which case your thought about it was not caused by it at all, because it doesn't even exist. Your thought about Mount Everest was caused instead by computer software input directly into your brain. And finally, there's yet another problem with the causal account. There's a long causal chain from the stimulus that is the object of thought all the way to the brain processes. The light photons travel from the sun, hit the snow of Mount Everest, travel through the air into the eyes, where they cause electrons to travel up the optic nerve to the visual cortex, where they cause other brain processes, and so on. This is one long chain of causal processes, with the Mount Everest at one end and the thought that represents it on the other. Yet, if we remove what we already know to be the two endpoints of this causal chain, and just look at it in purely materialistic terms, we just have one long causal chain with no specific endpoints that are objective. If the photons from the sun are A, the travel through the air is B, Mount Everest is E, traveling through the air from the mountain to our eyes is F through J, entering our eyes is K, and so on, there are no objective endpoints and no reason why T and E are the endpoints of this causal chain. Why shouldn't M represent F, or U represent B, and so on? We'd have to bring in yet another mind to say that T represents E, rather than M representing F. And bringing in another mind to assign meaning is once again to leave mind and representation unreduced and unexplained. So if both of these theories leave much to be desired, let's turn instead to biological theories of intentionality. We could think of a representation as a biological function designed by natural selection. The need to run away from predators is a biological function, and perhaps over time this function becomes a representation of predators, say. This theory avoids the misrepresentation problem. In this case, your thought that bears represent bears is caused not by the bears themselves, but by the desire to avoid predators. So therefore, if you mistakenly believe that an old stump is a bear, this can be explained as a result of your representation being caused by the desire to avoid predators. One problem with this theory is that it can account for sophisticated and abstract beliefs and thoughts concerning math, philosophy, and metaphorical reasoning, and so forth. Biological theories of intentionality also can't answer the either-or problem. If your desire to avoid both bears and stumps that look like bears has been wired in by evolution, then your thought that represents bears would actually represent bears or stumps that look like bears, not bears specifically. Some philosophers, in response to this, suggest that this is not a problem with this theory, that in fact thoughts do not have exact meaning and there is no specific fact of the matter about what any particular thought is. But this seems wrong. When you think about Mount Everest, there's a specific thing that you are thinking about. There's a specific object of your thought. Your thought about Mount Everest isn't a thought about Mount Everest or Lhotse or chocolate milk. It's about a specific object or referent. However, even if we accept that our thoughts are not about specific reference and accept the biological theory of intentionality, there remains yet another problem with it. If the theory can explain why certain thoughts have certain meanings, but to explain why any thought has any meaning at all in the first place, it has to appeal to biological functions, behavior directed at specific ends or goals. But the whole point of Darwinian evolution is that it explains life without having to refer to functions, purposes, and such, all of which are forms of teleology. The function of the stomach is not to digest food. The stomach causes the digestion of food, but it has no function. But if intentionality, or the meaning of thoughts, is to be explained in terms of biological function, then this theory illegitimately brings in teleology, which is anathema to materialist reduction. So let's take a look at a final materialist thought theory of intentionality. We could take several different positions towards various things. If we need to know how to move an elephant, we need to know its weight, size, and so on, so we could take the physical stance towards it. If we need to know what the elephant's heart does, we could take the design stance. We can act as if the heart were designed for a particular function, pumping blood, even though it wasn't actually designed. And finally, if we need to understand elephant behavior, we can act as if the elephant were consciously aware of its behavior. If the elephant trumpets to warn its herd of a predator, we can act as if the elephant were consciously deciding to do so rather than just acting on blind instinct. This is called the intentional stance. We act like the elephant is figuring things out mentally, and thus has intentionality, but really it doesn't. So this theory says that our own intentionality reduces to just that. We act as if we have intentionality, but really we do not. A few obvious problems pop up right away. For us to be taking a conscious stance towards anything presupposes intentionality. If our mind's not really directed towards specific targets or goals, then we couldn't take a stance towards anything. A possible reply is that a sub-process in the mind assigns intentionality to thoughts, called a homunculus, a little mind inside your mind. But then we would need to explain the intentionality of the homunculus by postulating yet another homunculus inside his head, and so on. Normally, this would lead to an infinite regress and leave the original problem unreduced, but philosopher Daniel Dennett proposes stupider and stupider homunculi until we get down to the bottom level of no homunculi at all. But to bridge that gap from no homunculi to the first, and stupidest homunculus, is not just a wide gap, but perhaps an uncrossable one. For to leap from non-intentional and non-teleological matter to a very, very stupid intentional homunculus still requires minimal intentionality. In short, there's still an infinite distance between very, very minimal intentionality and zero intentionality. Since all of the materialist theories of intentionality are lacking in many ways, several philosophers have suggested just dumping intentionality altogether. This view is called Eliminative Materialism. One of the more well-known versions postulates that beliefs, desires, fears, thoughts, and so forth do not exist. There's only the brain chemistry that can be described in neuroscientific terms, and that's it. Thoughts, beliefs, doubts, and the like, all intentional notions that are directed towards some specific target or subject, are a type of folk theory. Primitive peoples describe all sorts of intentional notions to nature, like the sea is angry about something, the sun desires sacrifices, and so on. The same for astrology and magic and the like. These are all folk theories, which modern science has refuted. So ascribing beliefs, desires, anger, fear, pain, and so forth to human beings is similar to astrology and folk magic. And a future neuroscience, far from completion at the moment, obviously, will also get rid of such notions from human beings. The obvious problem with this is how science and reason can even operate, or how we can even have any knowledge at all, since these all rely on intentional notions such as beliefs, thoughts, and so forth. This theory may be similar to the solipsist, who wants to convince us through philosophical argumentation that the external world really does not exist. The solipsist's purely philosophical premises are stacked against our direct and everyday experience of the external world. Clearly, the solipsist loses here. Similarly, the eliminative materialist stacks his purely philosophical premises against our direct and immediate experience of having beliefs, desires, and so forth, and so he may be on the losing side. So intentionality remains one of the primary puzzles for materialism of the mind, the other being qualia, or subjective experience. Whether a successful solution will be found or not remains to be seen.